Hey guys, it's Belmont. Yes, I'm wearing the same shirt. I'm knocking all three of these videos out in the same sitting. This is my reacts to the Junji Ito manga that he creates. That's the original artist. For sure, the last video and this one is presented by a YouTube channel called Horror Shows Presents. You can see it at the top left corner. All shout out goes to him. I think I don't know anything about him other than what I've read and this non-monetary disclaimer where he talks about he's trying to do it in fair use. He's not trying to make money off of Junji Ito's work, which I can respect. He's obviously a fan, and I respect that. This was the video sent, so this is the video I'm going to use. It's originally there, so you can watch it on his channel at Horror Show Presents. I don't know, I'm expecting this to be weird. I'm expecting the same style of manga art, the right to left reading, perhaps a hidden parable or story within it. I don't know. Let's just get into it. Let's see what weirdness we're in for.
Today's story, my friends, introduces a young girl who's been going through quite of a struggle for a couple weeks now, trying to find serenity within the dying hopes of living to see the following day. Her name is Kazuko, and right now she's alone, more alone than you think. She's also dying from hunger and utterly petrified of the world that is on the other side of that closed window, especially the thing that has her cowering in the corner. It's still waiting for her. Kazuko doesn't know what it really is or why it's after her, but what she does know is that it wants her dead. According to Kazuko's limited knowledge, so far from what little she knows, it all began about a month ago, when the world would be introduced to the shocking death of Terumi Fujino. Terumi Fujino was not only one of Kazuko's fellow classmates and a very close friend, but she was an idol who was loved by the country. In a way, you can say that Terumi had stolen the heart of every boy in Japan, and you can guarantee that the entire country was mortified, emotionally shocked when they began broadcasting her suicide. And not only had the following days come with hordes of irrational fans weeping for the loss of Japan's most beloved personality, what had also came from this shocking event was something cancerous, and would eventually grow into something that would send the grieving country into the shadows of the bizarre and darkness. It began with the developing theory that Terumi had no reason to kill herself, that the possible idea that she was killed was starting to make sense. There was something about Terumi's suicide that just didn't make any sense. Especially the fact that she would display her death to the open world. Kazuko knew that was not Terumi. Even if things had gotten so bad to where she was suicidal, there was just no way Terumi would kill herself with the intent of sending the country into a state of shock and grief. It's not how she wanted to be remembered. But when Kazuko and her friends had came upon a familiar face, Shiroshi, who's also a fellow classmate and the boyfriend of Terumi. You know, just imagining what he's going through right now, Kazuko just couldn't help but feel sorry for him. Not only had Shiroshi lost somebody that he truly loved, but recently, a lot of people had begun claiming that it was Shiroshi who pressured Terumi into giving up her life as Japan's most beloved celebrity, who had pushed her to the breaking point and even pressured her into killing herself. That people were starting to say that it was Shiroshi who killed Terumi. And yes, even though it does sound outlandish, delusional, a common thing with most of Terumi's fans, to be honest. To some people, it made perfect sense that the grief would have faded away by now. Well, unfortunately, it didn't. In fact, it only escalated into something bizarre, an obsessive mania. What followed Terumi's death would lead to a series of events that was making headlines. Nobody didn't expect that there would be days where many of Terumi's loyal fans would end up missing, most of them discovered in public parks or in the woods. Various groups of young fans who had committed mass suicide, killing themselves in the same fashion as Terumi. There were even some people who had theorized that the suicides were part of a supernatural effort to bring Terumi back from the grave. After the suicides, a growing number of people began claiming that they'd seen Terumi's ghost within the same woods that the suicide victims were found. And that was when Japan had stepped into a world that was abnormal and scary. It was every day there were multiple reports claiming that in the dead of night, people had sworn they'd seen Terumi's ghost in the form of a giant floating head. The media were calling it ghost mania, but unlike the common ghost stories you tend to hear, this one was just too weird and very hard to believe, and yet its popularity was growing fast. The whole thing was just wrong. It was something that had gotten way out of hand. The mass suicides, the fan hysteria, and now this ghost mania just wasn't how Terumi wanted to be remembered. But when people began showing photographs of Terumi's ghost, I think that was when the world began standing on the edge of reality and gazing upon something that even the human mind couldn't comprehend. The entire school was obsessed with the ghost story. It was like every classroom, the hallways, every student was filled with the sounds of ghost mania. The endless and constant debate of Terumi's ghost either being a hoax or the real thing. And when Kazuko had assumed that this ghost mania would have died a week ago, the world would have finally moved on to something else by now. Instead, it just becomes a repulsive and dying topic that continues inflating itself into something horrible. Regardless of the outstanding evidence that was being shown to the world, Kazuko just wasn't buying into the ghost mania. She just couldn't help but feel mortified by the whole thing. Kazuko did not expect that Shiroshi himself would also become a follower to this ghost mania, that his grief and guilt had driven him into accepting the very existence of Kurumi's ghost. According to Shiroshi, he had not only claimed to have physically seen Terumi's ghost, but he keeps finding her in his backyard in the middle of the night, just looking up at Shiroshi with those empty eyes. It was like she was trying to bewitch him, lure him from the house. Every night when she came, Shiroshi had resisted the temptation, but each night it just keeps getting more and more difficult to resist. And Shiroshi could easily tell what Kazuko was thinking. She didn't have to say anything. You could just look at her. That the only person who was trying to bring kindness and comfort to a friend who had been thrown into a pit of grief and insanity, Shiroshi knew that the only way Kazuko could ease his thoughts, bring him back into reality, prove himself that he is not insane, is if Kazuko were to join him tonight as he finally confronts this ghost and witness the existence of his supernatural claims, prove that he too had not fallen into this crazed mania that had corrupted the country and its people. It was 15 minutes ago where Shiroshi called Kazuko from a local payphone, claiming that he'd seen Terumi's ghost flying near the Aisho temple and was heading north. And even though Kazuko was reluctant to join in this ghost hunt in the dead of night, it was something that she had to do. She needed answers to relieve herself from the possibility that the ghost of Terumi was not real. It has to be a hoax. For a brief moment, she thought that Shiroshi was playing a sick joke, until she had seen it. In the sky, was the very thing that had driven this country into madness, floating over the nearby park just north of the temple. It just couldn't be, but it was. It was real. It was a giant floating head. And even though Kazuko's mind had tried easing her with the possibilities of this strange sighting, it was still a hoax, that the floating and lifeless head was a fake, regardless of how real it looked. She just couldn't resist the inner feeling that this was real. For some unexplained reason, it felt close enough for her to reach up and touch it. Such a strange fixation that Kazuko had with the floating head, suddenly broken by the shouting pleas from Shiroshi, who not only climbed one of the nearby trees, but was trying to capture the attention of Terumi's ghost. It was a situation that Kazuko did not expect to find herself in. Witnessing Shiroshi beg and cry for forgiveness, trying to reach out to the floating head, trying to ease his guilt and reconnect to the very thing that was taken away from him. And witnessing the strange event happening before her, Kazuko just couldn't help but dwell on that feeling, that there was something wrong about this. And as Kazuko watched Shiroshi reaching out for Kurumi's floating head, trying to gain her attention, Kazuko began noticing something in the trees moving near Shiroshi, a strange line that was emerging itself into the form of a noose. And as it began focusing itself onto the heedless Shiroshi, like a snake stalking its prey, that was when Kazuko began realizing that something bad was about to happen. It was instantaneous when the noose found itself around Shiroshi's neck, that when Shiroshi lost balance and began hanging from the trees, it was like Kazuko was watching a violent execution. And right before Kazuko could seek help, hopefully save a good friend from a horrible death, that was when she noticed Shiroshi's lifeless body had begun to move itself through the trees and reveal something that would bring forth a new chapter to this ghost mania. It was a scene that just could not be explained, nor easily accepted. Shiroshi's lifeless body was hanging from the neck of another giant floating head, except this one had his face. There were no words that could explain what was happening. That watching Shiroshi's lifeless body being dangled from side to side beneath two floating heads that were now embracing each other, like lost lovers. It was like Kazuko had been thrown into a nightmare. It was a scene that had automatically given Kazuko the overwhelming sense of panic and terror. Three days later, Shiroshi still missing. No trace of his body, no witnesses, aside from a handful of bizarre stories contributed to the ghost mania. According to the authorities, because of Shiroshi's depressive behavior, his long nights and wallowing in grief, burdened by the overwhelming guilt that he had over Terumi's death, there was nothing but the assumption that Shiroshi may have ran off and disappeared like the other missing fans who had succumbed to this mania. The fact is, without proof or any physical evidence of what had happened that night, there was just no way that anybody could explain what had happened to Shiroshi without being thrown into this ghost mania. And the fact that her floating head didn't have a wire noose hanging from its neck, like Shiroshi's floating head, it was now becoming very clear as to what happened the night of Terumi's death. But like I said, my friends, Terumi and Shiroshi being killed by giant floating head ghosts, there's just no way you can explain something like that to a world that was drowning with such a crazed mania. Even Kazuko's closest friends had not only found the story creepy, but something that they couldn't believe in. And sure, Kazuko may have connected a few dots before everybody else, relieved herself from the outlandish idea that a close friend had committed a violent suicide. But much like the world and its people, Kazuko still remained ignorant and unaware of the horrors that was about to come. That in just a few minutes, the world was about to learn that this ghost mania is just a mask to an unspeakable nightmare, a terror that was about to cleanse a country that had overwhelmed itself with grief, confusion, and delusional fantasy. Nobody was prepared for the oncoming storm, that when Kazuko and her troubled friends would look upon the beautiful sky and witness 4 strange objects in the far distance. At first, they looked like balloons, lost to the sky. But when the strange objects had gotten closer and closer, just close enough for Kazuko and her friends to make out the nooses, they were hanging on 4 floating heads. But these floating heads were not only speeding towards Kazuko and her friends, but they had their faces, twisted, deathly reflection of themselves, and now they're coming. The hanging nooses stiffened and centering onto the group of girls. Only Kazuko had a familiar realization of what was happening or what was about to happen. Right now, she was the only one who knew what these floating heads were trying to do. And even though Kazuko had barely saved herself from facing a horrible death, 2 of her friends, however, were not so lucky. The heads were like predators stalking their prey, chasing the 2 helpless girls from the open streets and into a nearby alley where they remained helpless and trapped like scared little mice. And it was such a horrible situation to be thrown in that there was no hope of getting out of this situation alive. Panic had begun to take its course as the 2 balloons centered their focus on the prey, just waiting for one of the girls to make a careless mistake. Oh yes, the girls were safe in the reaching nooses, but Kazuko knew that it was only a matter of time before the floating heads were to find a way to capture their prey. The floating monstrosities centering their attention on the girls, watching their every move, covering every angle, and removing every possibility of escape. They were even trying to lure the girls back into the open, just giving that small opportunity for one of them to make a foolish escape. It was now becoming a moment where these girls were starting to realize that they were going to die, that any moment now, those nooses were going to find themselves wrapped around the necks of these girls and join the other 2 who were taken by these things. When the commotion had attracted a local resident within one of the buildings, a nameless stranger who did not expect to witness a scene that could only be described as a bizarre dream, 2 terrified girls being hunted by these monstrosities hovering over the buildings. And when Kazuko had seen this stranger pull out a crossbow, playing the role as a selfless hero with the noble intent of bringing down these horrible monsters, it was a moment where that inner fear had begun to fade away, that Kazuko would experience a brief moment of hope, embrace such a moment where she would witness the stranger shoot the floating head with a piercing arrow, the one that resembled her friend. And as this ungodly thing writhed itself with such pain and torment, slowly deflating into a twisted mockery of her friend as it descended to the ground. Watching the thing die had given relief from such a terrifying world. It was such a hopeful moment, until Kazuko had witnessed the horrid results of the dying monstrosity. What had become of her friend when the monster had been slain? Her screaming was horrible as it began losing its tone, and you could see the suffering that the girl was going through as her head deflated into a flattened, wrinkled grotesque. That moment, my friends, standing over the body of her dead friend, it was a mystery that had remained itself as a morbid enigma. But only one thing was now making sense. This whole time, the suicides, the ghost mania, the mystery behind these floating heads, Kazuko had finally realized what was happening. This wasn't the beginning of an invasion. She knew that this was death. The beginning chapter of something very terrible. This was a cleansing against humanity. Kazuko didn't remember how she got home, or how she even managed to escape her floating head. That's right, her floating head. Outside Kazuko's home were the 3 giant heads that looked exactly like her family, like a pack of hungry predators stalking her loved ones through the windows, just waiting for their prey to come out into the open. And being out into the open world, the beginning of a new world, my friends, it was just only a matter of time before Kazuko would be reunited with their own special predator and be driven into the shadows as she ran into the house. All of Japan was under attack by a swarm of flying objects. Nobody knew what these things were, where they came from, or even why they're doing this. Within a single day, these floating heads had literally brought the country to its knees. Japan didn't even have a chance. They couldn't even find a way to fight back against these things. That when people tried attacking these things with arrows, gunshots, fire, or any type of injury, they would mysteriously end up suffering the same fate. Kazuko's father was the first to go, a stubborn and strong-willed man who just wasn't buying into the dangers of the floating head crisis. Noticing how these things would grab people by the neck with their hanging nooses, he thought that if he were to just cover his neck, then he should be fine when walking outside and go where he needed to go and do what he needed to do without falling prey to these floating heads. And not only had Kazuko's father found himself being taken away by his very own floating head, regardless of the efforts to protect his neck, he didn't save him from suffering a violent death, as a noose had nearly twisted and torn the man's body into two. And as days went by, it was like the world had been thrown into the dark ages. There was no electricity, no way of knowing what was happening in the outside world, and most of all, there was no food. Kazuko's brother, Yosuke, was not only fed up with their grim situation, but was convinced that he had the strength, the fortitude to go out, regardless of what happened to his father. Yosuke was convinced that he could fend himself against these things and hopefully be able to bring back some food. And when seeing Yosuke fulfill his promises of taking a stand against his floating head, succeeding on tangling its noose with an umbrella, watching her brother run into the streets had finally given Kazuko hope that there was a possibility that they were going to live through this ungodly nightmare. That was about a week ago, and eventually it became too much for Kazuko's mother, who had succumbed to the feelings of motherly love. Now it was just Kazuko, no friends, no family, and all alone, with the exception of the thing that's outside her window. For a couple days now, it's been talking to her, persuading Kazuko into coming out for some fresh air, to accept her fate. It knows that Kazuko is dying. It wants to help her, to free her from such an unbearable pain, to relieve her from her loneliness by coming out and joining the others. And even if this thing was promising a painless death, that it was giving Kazuko the dwelling idea of offering her body into becoming a hanging decoration to this monster. Death was death, and Kazuko did not want to die. But when she heard the distant sound of a familiar voice, it was her brother, pounding on the window, desperately trying to get into the house, saying that he had finally found some food, that he managed to outsmart the monster long enough to finally make it home. It was definitely his voice. Yasuke was still alive, being overwhelmed with excitement and joy as Kazuko rushed herself to the window, tears of joy as she was about to be reunited with her brother, that she doesn't have to be alone through this horrible nightmare. Just as Kazuko had opened the window, before she would fall into her brother's arms, what was on the other side of that window was not only Yasuke, but a horror that had succeeded on finally reaching its prey. It was her brother's body, made into looking like he was still alive, with the same umbrella he used against the giant head. And as Kazuko heard her brother's voice, which was not Yasuke's voice, but the voice of the giant head that had his face, it was obviously a trap, a successful tactic that had drawn Kazuko out into the open world and finally be able to join the others.
I don't know. I said that a lot throughout this. It's just, again, that was just my initial reaction to it. I have no history with manga or very much of the Japanese culture, much less their horror culture. And at least from the pains shown, the story was weak. The narrator did a great job. Far more interesting, far more depth. And maybe that's all in the manga, and you know, he's just hitting keynote images and narrating the fluff, so to speak. I don't know how it really classifies as horror. I mean, yeah, I guess people are dying from a monster, and maybe there's some deeper philosophical meaning that I'm just missing through all three of these. I mean, I'm really lost. So yeah, if you know this story, or the moral, the underlying tale, the relevance, they can share, please comment below, let me know. I like the art. I keep saying that because it's good. But there was a book when I was little. I only remember it had a skull on it and looked like kind of water painted. God, what was that book? Scary Tales or something like that. It was just full of this kind of horror stories, I guess, parables, whatever it is. Right? Yeah, I can see maybe a young teenager down being frightened of this, at least as presented, the surface of it being scary, but I don't know, it just didn't do anything for me. I missed it. I know I'm missing it. That's the thing, is I don't want anyone who's a fan of the manga, or Junji Ito, if I'm saying that correctly, to feel like I'm trashing either the genre or the artist, because I'm not. I recognize that it's either childish and pedantic, or I'm missing something. And for someone to take the time, like this YouTube channel, Horror Show Presents, to narrate it, and narrate it so very well, tells me I'm missing it. I'm missing, again, something, a cultural influence, a genre influence from that culture. I don't know, but I appreciate you watching. Hit like, hit subscribe, hit the bell, comment below, let me know what you think. And again, if you can explain this one or any of these three to me, please do, because it's just... Alright, y'all. Thanks for watching.